The 15th of March, 1954, gave Harlem one of those nights, and it didn't begin with gunshots, or sirens, or screaming crowds. There are nights Harlem forgets, and then there are nights Harlem carries forever like a scar that never fades. It began quietly, the way the most dangerous things always do, with a woman standing in a doorway, not crying, not speaking, just staring forward as if her body had arrived home before her mind did. Her name was Lenox Johnson, and she was Bumpy Johnson's sister-in-law. One glove was missing, her coat hung open, and her cheek was already swelling, red turning dark, the clear shape of a hand pressed into her skin. That mark mattered, because accidents don't leave clean handprints. Only men who feel safe do. Bumpy Johnson was sitting at the table reading when he looked up and saw her face. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, slow and controlled, the way men stand when something inside them has locked into place. Eleanor tried to speak, but couldn't. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Her husband followed her in, pale and shaking, already knowing something terrible had happened, and already knowing he was powerless to undo it. The room felt smaller, heavier, like the walls were leaning in to listen. Bumpy didn't ask what happened at first. He didn't need to. He studied the handprint, the angle of it, the confidence behind it. Someone had touched her because they believed nothing would happen to them. When Eleanor finally found her voice, it came out broken. She said it happened in a hallway near 141st Street. Bad lighting, old building, the kind of place where things disappear and nobody asks why. There were 3 men. One showed a badge, not long enough to read, just long enough to silence her. Another laughed, low and casual, like this was routine. The third one touched her face slowly, choosing her, deciding something. When she pulled away, they shoved her into the wall, hard enough to scare her, not hard enough to leave evidence. That mattered too. They didn't want her dead. They wanted her smaller. They told her to remember where she was, told her Harlem women forget themselves too easily. And then they walked away like nothing had happened. That was the mistake. Bumpy walked to the window and looked out at Harlem. Cars passed. Music floated through the night. People laughed somewhere down the block. The city had no idea what had just been triggered. Eleanor began to cry then, quiet and ashamed. And that hurt more than the violence itself, because shame is what men like that depend on. Bumpy turned back to her and asked one question, calm and deadly in its simplicity. Did anyone see? She nodded. Plenty of people. Nobody helped. That answer changed the shape of the night, because now it wasn't just about 3 men in a hallway. It was about a system that watched and did nothing. Bumpy reached for his coat. Eleanor grabbed his arm and begged him to stop, her voice shaking as she said they would kill him. Bumpy gently removed her hand like a man ending a conversation that could not continue. He told her they touched family, and that already meant someone was going to die. The only question left was who. He didn't slam the door when he left. He closed it carefully, and everyone in that apartment understood what that meant. Outside, Harlem felt different. Men on corners noticed him walking and went quiet. Doors closed. Windows lit up. Nobody asked questions, because nobody needed answers. Everyone knew the rule. When Bumpy Johnson put his coat on at this hour, it wasn't business. It was judgment. His first move wasn't violence. It was confirmation. A doorman who suddenly couldn't meet his eyes. A bartender who poured without charging and whispered a word he shouldn't have known. Vice. That word kept coming back. Not street drunks, not random animals. Vice. Protected men. The worst kind. By midnight, Bumpy knew enough. One of the men had been a cop, or someone close enough to a badge that the difference didn't matter. That changed everything, because when a man with a badge touches a woman in Harlem, it isn't just assault, it's a message. It says the law is watching and choosing silence. Bumpy stopped under a streetlight and looked up, and for a moment Harlem thought this would explode fast. It didn't. That was worse, because Bumpy smiled, not with happiness, but with certainty. The kind of smile that means the plan is already finished in his head. He turned back toward the blocks where vice men drank and felt untouchable. And behind him Harlem whispered, mothers pulling daughters closer, men staying awake longer than usual. Because everyone understood the same terrifying truth. If Bumpy handled this wrong, Harlem would burn. If he handled it right, powerful men would disappear quietly. And by the time Eleanor finally fell asleep, exhausted and shaking, unaware of what was unfolding outside her window, Bumpy Johnson had already crossed the point of no return. This was no longer about revenge. It was about proving something dangerous. That Harlem women were not free targets, that badges did not make men gods, and that fear did not belong to only one side. By morning, someone powerful was going to realize they had made the worst mistake of their life, because they didn't just touch a woman. They challenged a neighborhood. The man who flashed that badge was about to learn why Harlem never trusted uniforms and why protection can disappear overnight. By sunrise, Harlem already knew something was wrong. Not because anyone announced it, not because sirens screamed through the streets, but because the air felt watched. Police cars rolled slower than usual. Men in plain coats stood too long on corners, pretending to read papers they never turned. Store owners opened late. Mothers walked their children to school even when they normally didn't. Harlem had learned over decades to read danger without words, and this morning the message was clear. Someone important was nervous. The hallway attack hadn't been about desire. It had been about permission. Permission given quietly, by men who knew the system would protect them if anything went wrong. That was the part that made Bumpy's jaw tighten. When power decides it can touch your family and walk away, the problem is no longer one man. It's the shield around him. Illinois warned him again. Going after a vice man meant waking up a machine that didn't sleep. Files would appear. Charges would be invented. Raids would come down hard and fast, not on the guilty, but on the neighborhood. That's how the city punished resistance. Bumpy nodded, because he already knew. He also knew something else. Machines break when you remove their lubrication, so he started there. By noon, 2 clubs Mallory frequented were dry. Not closed, just dry. No free drinks, no backroom laughter. By evening, a shop owner who paid weekly insurance money hadn't been visited in days. Another owner sent word that a collector didn't show. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was precise. Money didn't vanish all at once. It slowed, like blood flow being pinched. Mallory felt it. He tried to hide it with anger. He yelled at a bartender. He threatened a runner. He made calls that didn't get returned. The confidence he wore like a uniform began to crack. When men feel their protection thinning, they make mistakes. Mallory made one that night. He bragged too loudly in a back room that the girl would keep quiet, and that Harlem always does. Someone heard him. Someone always does. That someone found Bumpy before midnight. The name wasn't enough. Bumpy needed the shape of the shield. Who answered Mallory's calls when things got tight? Who moved files when complaints surfaced? Who turned a hallway crime into nothing? The answer sat higher up, exactly where Harlem had always suspected but never proved. A captain, not a street bully, not a drunk with a badge. A man who smiled for cameras and shook hands at church events, who talked about order while his people hunted quietly. That realization made the city feel smaller, because when a captain protects a vice man, it tells every predator the same thing. Go ahead. Bumpy didn't react publicly. That mattered. Harlem had learned the hard way that public anger invited public punishment. Instead, he applied pressure where it couldn't be photographed. Runners were delayed. Deliveries missed windows. Promises weren't kept. The city didn't stop working. It just stopped working smoothly. That's when the patrols increased. That's when cars idled outside buildings they'd never noticed before. That's when the message arrived, loud and clear, without a single word spoken. Back off. Eleanor felt it even without leaving the apartment. The phone rang and went silent. Footsteps paused outside the door. Her hands shook when she poured water. Shame tried to creep back in, the kind that tells a woman she caused her own pain by existing. Bumpy sat with her once and said nothing, but the presence mattered. He wanted her to understand something important. The fear she felt wasn't hers to carry. It belonged to the men who thought she would stay quiet. That night, a small-time collector vanished for a few hours. When he came back, he wouldn't look anyone in the eye. He stopped working for Mallory the next day. No one asked why. They didn't need to. Fear was moving in the right direction. One seam split quietly. A tired man named Walter Pike, a clerk who moved files from one desk to another, made a mistake born of exhaustion and guilt. He copied a log he shouldn't have copied. Times, names, a pattern of erasures that pointed in one direction. When Bumpy saw it, he didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He closed the folder and understood exactly how dangerous the next step would be. Because now the problem wasn't proving what happened in that hallway. The problem was what to do with the truth when the truth threatens to burn the whole block. Expose it too fast and Harlem would pay, move too slow, and Eleanor's pain would be buried forever. There was only one path left, narrow and unforgiving, a path that didn't end with sirens but with silence. Outside, Harlem stayed awake. Men spoke softly. Women walked in pairs. The city was bracing for impact without knowing when it would land. The badge that lied had set something in motion, and the shield around it was starting to crack. Not enough to shatter, enough to make a sound, and the men inside that shield heard it. The captain decided to strike first, and by dawn, Harlem would learn how far the system would go to protect its own. By the third day, the truth was no longer hidden. It was simply ignored. Harlem understood that silence from the city was not confusion. It was a decision. Complaints went nowhere. Doors that once opened now stayed shut. Men who had promised to look into it suddenly forgot names and faces. The message was brutal in its simplicity. This did not matter to them. What happened to a black woman in a hallway was not worth disrupting the comfort of men in power. That realization hit harder than the assault itself. Because pain could be survived, humiliation could be swallowed, but abandonment carved something deeper. Evelyn felt it when she finally stepped outside again and noticed how careful people were being around her. Not distant, not cold, protective. Too protective, as if everyone knew she had been marked, not by shame, but by danger. She saw it in the way shopkeepers watched the street before greeting her, in the way neighbors lingered nearby pretending to have errands. Harlem wasn't looking away anymore. Harlem was watching. Bumpy understood what that meant. The city had chosen its side, so Harlem would choose its own. He told no one to riot. He didn't call meetings. He didn't give speeches. He did something far more dangerous. He allowed Harlem to organize itself, quietly, naturally, the way communities do when they realize nobody is coming to save them. Men stopped drinking in places connected to vice. Women shared information the way they shared recipes. Teenagers stood on corners longer than usual, not talking much, just observing. Harlem became alert, and alert neighborhoods are hard to control. The racists who had touched Evelyn felt it too, even if they didn't understand it yet. Their usual paths felt colder. Their jokes didn't land. Their protection didn't feel solid anymore. One of them tried to laugh it off in a bar and realized nobody laughed back. That's when fear began to replace arrogance. Because hatred is loud when it feels supported, and very quiet when it doesn't. This time, Harlem didn't turn on itself. It turned inward. When a young man was dragged out of a building for nothing, neighbors followed. Not shouting, not fighting, just watching. When a store owner was threatened, other owners stood inside his shop until the officers left. When a mother was questioned, another mother stood beside her and didn't move. No signs, no chance, just presence. The kind of presence that says, "You are not alone anymore." That was when the story stopped being about one woman. That was when it became about Harlem. Bumpy stayed in the background. That mattered. He let the city focus its anger on him because it distracted them from what was really happening. While they watched him, Harlem learned how to protect itself. While they whispered his name, neighbors learned each other's routines. While they planned raids, information moved faster than orders. And then something dangerous happened. One of the men involved, the one who had laughed that night, left Harlem in a hurry. Not transferred, not promoted, gone. No explanation, no announcement, just gone. That absence sent a shock through the shield, protecting the others. Because disappearances like that don't happen without permission being revoked somewhere. The captain felt it. The vice men felt it. The racists felt it. They had touched one woman to prove Harlem was powerless. Instead, they had awakened a neighborhood. By the end of the week, the city realized it had lost control of the narrative. People weren't asking what Evelyn did wrong. They were asking why men who touched her were still walking free. And that question was more dangerous than any riot. Because once people start asking why, the system has to start answering. Harlem didn't need to shout anymore. It had already decided. If the city wouldn't protect its women, Harlem would. If the law wouldn't draw the line, the neighborhood would. And somewhere inside the shield that had once felt unbreakable, a decision was made to end this quietly, before the silence turned into something louder. The next move wouldn't come from Harlem, it would come from a terrified system trying to clean its own mess. By the end of that week, fear had switched sides. It didn't announce itself. It didn't explode. It crept in quietly, the way real fear always does, slipping into conversations, interrupting sleep, turning confident men into nervous ones. The racists who had touched Bumpy Johnson's sister-in-law no longer walked the same. Their shoulders stayed tight. Their eyes moved too fast. They started checking behind them for no clear reason. Power had left their bodies, and they didn't know how to survive without it. They had expected noise, screaming, riots, chaos. That's what the city always prepared for. That's what the newspapers were trained to describe. But Harlem gave them something worse. Harlem gave them silence and memory. Every step they took felt recorded. Every laugh felt forced. Every badge felt lighter, less convincing, like a costume everyone had suddenly agreed to stop believing in. The captain made calls, quiet ones, late ones. He wanted this gone, not solved, gone. Files were revisited, timelines adjusted, stories cleaned. The system tried to erase the incident the way it erased everything uncomfortable. But something had gone wrong. Harlem had already absorbed the truth. And once a community does that, paper stops working. Then, the first crack showed. One of the men involved was suddenly reassigned. No explanation, no ceremony. Just moved out of Harlem like a piece on a board, being quietly removed so the game could continue. The city hoped that would be enough. It wasn't, because removal isn't the same as accountability, and Harlem knew the difference. People began to talk openly now, not shouting, not accusing, just stating facts. A woman had been touched. Racists had done it. The system had protected them, and Harlem had stepped in where the law refused to. That version of the story moved faster than any official report ever could. It passed through churches, through barber chairs, through kitchen tables, where parents finally said out loud what they'd warned their children about in whispers for years. The racists tried to reclaim control. One of them made a joke in a bar about how nothing happened. The room went quiet, not tense, just empty. He finished his drink alone. Another tried to lean on a shop owner for free goods and was told no, not angrily, calmly. The word no hit harder than any punch, because no meant the rules had changed. That was the moment they understood what they had done wrong. They hadn't just assaulted a woman. They had unified a neighborhood that survived by staying fragmented. Harlem had stopped asking for permission to protect its own, and once that happens, power structures lose their leverage. Evelyn walked more now, not because she was fearless, but because she refused to shrink. Every step she took became part of the warning. She didn't speak publicly. She didn't have to. Her presence said enough. The shame that had been pushed onto her was now resting exactly where it belonged on the men who thought they could touch her and walk away unchanged. The system didn't collapse. Systems rarely do. But it adjusted. An adjustment is how you measure impact. Patrols pulled back. Certain names stopped appearing in reports. Certain men learned to stay away from certain blocks. Harlem didn't become safe overnight, but it became alert, and alert communities don't break easily. People would later argue about what really scared the racists away. Some said it was Bumpy Johnson. Some said it was the neighborhood. The truth was more frightening than either answer alone. It was both. It was the understanding that violence wasn't required when unity was enough, that the threat wasn't revenge. It was memory. Harlem remembered who crossed the line, and Harlem didn't forget. Years later, when people talked about 1954, they didn't talk about a police report or a court case. They talked about the week the neighborhood stood up without shouting, the week a woman was touched, and the city expected silence. The week Harlem answered in a way that shocked everyone, because the most powerful response wasn't bloodshed. It was refusal. Refusal to be quiet. Refusal to be small. Refusal to let racism hide behind badges and paperwork. And that refusal became a message that traveled farther than fear ever could. But the final twist, the one the city never wanted exposed, would surface months later, proving that what Harlem stopped was far bigger than one crime. Months later, the city pretended nothing had happened. That was always the final move. Silence. No trials. No headlines. No justice the law would recognize. On paper, the incident never existed. No official complaint. No guilty men. No apology. The system erased it the way it erased so many black lives, assuming time would do the rest of the work. But Harlem does not forget the things meant to break it. Evelyn healed slowly. Not just her face, but her sense of safety. Bruises fade faster than memories. Some nights she still woke up before dawn, heart racing, convinced she heard footsteps in the hallway. But every morning she stepped outside anyway. She walked with her head up, not because she felt brave, but because she refused to disappear. And Harlem noticed. People greeted her differently now, with respect, with quiet acknowledgement, with the understanding that what happened to her belonged to all of them. That was the part the racists never predicted. They thought the damage would isolate her. Instead, it connected her to an entire neighborhood. The men who touched her never returned to those blocks the same way again. One transferred out of Harlem and never came back. Another started drinking heavily and stopped being seen in public. A third vanished into a different part of the city, where nobody knew his name. None of them were punished the way victims expect punishment to look, but all of them learned something far more terrifying than prison. They learned there were places where they were no longer welcome. Harlem didn't celebrate. There were no speeches, no victory laps, no men boasting about what they'd done. That wasn't the culture. Harlem understood that survival didn't come from noise. It came from memory, from quiet agreements passed between neighbors, from knowing who to stand beside when the system looked away. Bumpy Johnson never spoke publicly about what happened. He didn't need to. His silence was intentional. Loud men attract attention. Silent men change rules. He continued walking the same streets, sitting in the same rooms, reading the same books. But people noticed something subtle. When his name came up, it was no longer spoken with just fear. It was spoken with trust. Because when a racist touched a woman connected to him, Harlem didn't burn. Harlem didn't riot. Harlem didn't beg the city to care. Harlem organized. That lesson traveled faster than any headline ever could. It reached other neighborhoods, other cities, other men who believed power meant immunity. They heard what happened in 1954. Not from newspapers, but from whispers, from warnings, from the way certain streets suddenly felt hostile to the wrong kind of confidence. Years later, mothers would tell their daughters about that year. Not to scare them, but to prepare them. They would say that there was a time when the city decided a black woman didn't matter. And Harlem answered by proving she did. They would explain that dignity isn't something the system hands you. It's something your people defend when no one else will. The system adjusted, like it always does. New faces replaced old ones. New uniforms walked old routes. Racism didn't disappear. It never does. But it learned something it hadn't learned before. That Harlem was not just a place you controlled with fear. It was a place that could respond without asking permission. Evelyn eventually moved on with her life. She worked. She laughed again. She built something quiet and ordinary, which was exactly the victory she deserved. She never became a symbol by choice. History made her one anyway, not because she was loud, but because she survived and Harlem stood behind her when it mattered. People still argue about what shocked the city the most in 1954. Some say it was how fast the racists disappeared. Others say it was how calmly Harlem responded. But those who were there know the real answer. What shocked everyone wasn't violence. It was unity. It was a neighborhood deciding, together, that touching one woman meant facing all of them. That racism didn't get to hide behind badges. That silence would no longer protect predators. And that fear, once used against Harlem, could be redirected right back at those who depended on it. That was the warning Harlem sent. Not written, not shouted, not enforced by courts, but understood. And once understood, it never had to be repeated.